Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Amy Aldridge Sanford. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm the Associate Provost at Texas A&M University Corpus Christi. On behalf of Academic Affairs, I'd like to welcome everyone today as we kick off Asian American and Pacific Islander Month. Today, we will answer the question, what is AAPI? But first, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement in solidarity with our Indigenous neighbors. I come to you today from the geographic area colonized as Corpus Christi, Texas, USA, a coastal community bordering the Gulf of Mexico. This space on Turtle Island was originally inhabited by the Indi or Lipan Apache, the Kawankawa, and the Colatacan peoples, among others whose tribal and nation names we have unfortunately forgotten. Our gratitude to the land and water and to the Indigenous people who have and who continue to steward both. May we all commit today to eradicate the erasure of Indigenous cultures wherever we live. We are recording today's event and ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box where they will be monitored by Susan Latore and Julie Shuttlesworth. We'll get to questions at the end of the hour if there is time. We are happy to virtually welcome acclaimed AAPI scholar, Dr. Scott Kurashige, to the island today. Our student body vice president, Gyataro Young, will introduce our guest speaker, but first I have the pleasure of introducing Gyataro. Gyataro Young was born and raised in Okinawa, Japan as a military child and moved to Corpus Christi with his family when he was a senior in high school, where he graduated from Flower Bluff. Today, he is a successful college senior majoring in biomedical science at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. He plans to one day be an orthopedic surgeon. Please help me welcome the Island University's SGA's Vice President, Gyataro Young.
Hi, okay. Scott Kurashige is a professor and chair in the Department of Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies at TCU, and past president of the American Studies Association. He is the author or co-author of 4 books, including The Shifting Grounds of Race, Black Japanese Americans in the Making of Multi-Ethnic Los Angeles, and The Next American Revolution, Sustainable Activism for the 21st Century with Grace Lee Boggs. Welcome, Dr. Kurashige.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those generous introductions. And I'm going to pull up my screen here and start my slideshow. Okay, can you see the slideshow?
Yes, okay, we can see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So we're going to do an introduction to Asian American and Pacific Islander history and culture, and we'll talk some about demography and geography, and we'll also talk about politics and activism. So we're going to try to cover a lot in a short period of time, and obviously this is just going to be a very, very general introduction, but hopefully we'll leave you with some specific things that you'll learn about today, and then some topics that you'll be interested in reading and learning more about, because obviously there's a lot more books and podcasts and websites you can consult on this topic. So I'm really happy to be joining you. Congratulations on your Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and we send you a lot of love and support in your work from the Dallas-Fort Worth area and TCU, where I'm at. So the first thing I just want you to think about, and since we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to have a lot of time to get into discussions of this, but I want you to think about when the term Asian American was first coined and used. And I'm not even sure I can easily see the chat box, but if you want to just take a guess at it, go ahead and put it in the chat box when you think the term was first coined and put into sort of regular discussion in the media or in academia, or even amongst people of Asian descent themselves in the US. And I don't know that it's easy for me to see the chat. Okay. So I see 1990s. Yeah, so this is really important to stress. The term, when we talk about the history of Asians in the US, we go back hundreds of years to the 1500s even, right? So Asians have been in the Americas and what is now the United States for much longer than people usually realize, which is why Asians are oftentimes referred to as perpetual foreigners, right? There are people who are 9th, 10th, 13th generation, Asians in the Americas, in both what is now the US and also Mexico, the Caribbean, Latin America, Canada as well. The term first gets used in the late 1960s, right? If you think about what's going on at that point, this is when a lot of particularly racial minority groups are redefining who they are, particularly as there's a lot of activism going on in relationship for Asian Americans to the Vietnam War, but significantly relationship to the civil rights and Black Power movements, right? So that questioning of who belongs in America, what does it mean to integrate, what does it mean to have social justice, what does it mean to have peace and liberation. This is the context in which Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean Americans, the main groups at that time are coming together and coining this term Asian American. It was particularly a group at UC Berkeley called the Asian American Political Alliance. That's the first known usage of it as an organization name. So 1968-69, when people are fighting for Asian American studies for the first programs and classes in Asian American studies itself. So it wasn't something that the census came up with. It wasn't something that the government came up with. Prior to this time, if you were to talk about Asians in the mainstream discourse, they would have used the term Oriental, which eventually more and more people found offensive. That was sort of objectifying who Asian Americans were. That was saying the Occident is the center of the world, the Orient is the far off land. There are many stereotypes associated with the idea of Orientalism. And so it becomes a term of self-identification, but also, again, at that time, very much reflecting the radical politics of the 1960s. So just as the term Negro gets replaced by Black and then eventually African American, Asian American is a term, again, of self-identification and of consciously anti-racist identification, and very much in solidarity with the Black Power movement and Black identity of the time. But the concept of AAPI is something that does come much more from government usage, nonprofit usage, and in some cases there are organizations. So when Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are voluntarily coming together to form coalitions, I think it makes sense to use a formation like Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders if they're actually working together. What particularly Pacific Islanders object to, and what I find important to recognize, is we really shouldn't use the term if there's not a voluntary coming together of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, because Pacific Islanders do have in many ways a distinct experience. As we'll talk about, some of them were part of forceful integration into the US and through colonization, and many of them still, Pacific Island nations don't have independence, right? Guam, Samoa, these places are still colonies of the US. So in many ways, there's a different experience that Pacific Islanders have as indigenous peoples in the Pacific that can, again, lead to points of solidarity with Asian Americans, but not necessarily the notion that they're part of one group. In fact, a lot of native Pacific Islander scholars identify more with indigenous studies and Native American studies than Asian American studies. So again, we all try to work together as much as we can in coalition. So that's important to point out. And so I'm not particularly an expert on Pacific Islanders. I do have some knowledge and I'm going to incorporate that into the presentation, but I want to make that clear up front. My expertise is more in Asian American studies. Okay, let me make sure I can advance my slide now. Okay, so just some basic facts. There are today over 22 million Asian Americans in the US. Now that's not obviously the biggest group in the country, but when I was born, that number would have been a little over 1 million and less than 2 million, right? So there's a big distinction between, just in my own lifetime and really in your lifetime as well, how much the Asian American population has grown in proportion. The Pacific Islander population is 1.4 million, and actually because there's been migration and there's a diaspora, there are in many cases more Pacific Islanders in the continental US than, or in the continental US and Hawaii than in their home nations in other parts of the Pacific. Though of course, that also includes Native Hawaiians who are now part of a US state, but did exist as an independent kingdom and nation prior to the US annexing Hawaii. The largest groups probably you see most, in discussion, Chinese. Obviously, China is a very big country of over 1 billion people, as is India, right? So it makes sense that those groups would be in large numbers here. Filipinos, that is because the Philippines, as we'll talk about, was once a US possession, right? A colony of the United States. And so Filipinos, even when there were exclusion laws against all the other Asian Americans, could still come to the US because they were considered US nationals. So not full citizens. They didn't have the right to become citizens, but they had the right to migrate to the US at that time. Vietnamese, again, obviously, there was a lot of connection between the US and Vietnam because of the Vietnam War, right? The US argued that it was fighting for the South Vietnamese people against communism. And as you can probably imagine, the same thing with Korea, right? The US argument was that it needed to support the South Korean government against what the US argued was the threat of communism during the Cold War that North Korea represented. So 1.7 million Korean Americans. Japanese Americans, again, at the time I was born, and I'm fourth generation Japanese American, would have been the largest group by far of Asians in the US, in part because, again, Japan had been effectively ruled by the US after World War II. But even long before that, Japan was the main source of labor migration to the US. And so my great-grandfather, first in my family, on my father's side, to come to the US, really didn't even come to the US. He went to Hawaii as a sugar plantation worker under a contract labor arrangement in 1889. So we see this wave of Japanese coming to Hawaii even before it's a US territory, and then continuing as it becomes a US territory. And then there are others, of course, coming to the continental US, some directly from Japan, others from Hawaii. But today there's growing populations of South and Southeast Asians. So we would also want to talk about Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Burmese. We want to talk about Thai, Cambodian, Laotians. Many of the Southeast Asians, like Vietnamese, other who are also part of Southeast Asia, of course, are coming as refugees of the Vietnam War. And we'll say a little bit more about that. Now, Texas has a very fast growing population in general. And within that, Asians are the largest, the fastest growing in proportion racial group in Texas. So about 1.5 million Asians now in this state, which is the third in the US, following California and New York. And the Pacific Islander population of the state is much smaller at 25,000. So if you could put this in the chat, and I'll just say this all at once. If you've ever taken a class focused specifically on Asians in the US or Pacific Islanders, just put that in the chat when you took it. High school, college, junior high, middle school, elementary. And I'll do this relatively quickly. You can keep putting it in there as I talk. Or have you ever had something like, a 2-week segment of a course? High school, college, graduate school. I know some of you have gone to graduate school, focused specifically on Asian Americans. So I'm not seeing any, but even if you have, generally when I do this, really with audiences just about everywhere, most people have not had any kind of formal education, right, on Asian American history or Pacific Islander history or specific aspects of Asian Americans in the United States, right? People might have had a geography class where you talked about Asian countries, right? China, Japan, India. But the specific aspects of Asian American history are usually left out. And we took an elementary school class in Hawaii. Well, that makes sense, right? Where because of migration patterns, Asians in many parts of Hawaii are actually the largest racial group and have assumed a lot of positions in education, government, and the economy. So that's important to recognize, that we're talking about a topic that most of us, including myself, really don't learn anything about, right? And if we don't learn things in school, what do we learn? We learn things from movies and TV, or from just, family discussions. But again, a lot of times when people have survived wars, or in the case of my mother, being in a concentration camp, including in Texas, Crystal City, Texas, during World War II, they don't often want to talk about these painful experiences, or they don't want to pass those painful experiences on to their children, right? So oftentimes either the history is lost and it needs to be recovered, or it's distorted, right, taught to us by mostly, movie stereotypes or TV stereotypes or general societal stereotypes. And then it really becomes an important issue. How do we have an education that gives us a well-rounded view of the people that make up our communities, that make up our country, that make up the world, right? So this was, again, really formative to the idea of Asian American identity itself, that you needed Asian American studies to learn our own histories, but that there would also be more equity, right, and understanding across racial groups in this country. And obviously, this was at a time when people were confronting issues of racism, right, in their own lives and in their institutions. So we're going to just go over some very, very broad themes, talking about the issue of Western colonization of Asia and the Pacific, a very, very brief history of Asian migration to the US and refugee resettlement, some examples of the racial stereotypes and forms of discrimination against Asian Americans, and then some contemporary trends and issues in Asian American Pacific Islander studies. So the first thing to recognize is a point that scholars of Black migration to Britain have pointed out in a catchphrase: "We are here because you were there." Right? And so actually, countries like India, China, Japan, Korea, the large countries, weren't necessarily seeking to migrate, right, and form relations with the US or the West. China at one time actually had a much better seafaring, advanced seafaring technology than Europe, but decided to turn more inward. And it was only because these countries were opened up, right, so-called opened up by Western influence, that you begin to see these relations, first economic relations, but increasingly people migrations, right, from Asia to the US. So that phrase, "we are here because you were there," really is describing the experience of colonization that leads to parts of Asia, and eventually much of Asia and the Pacific, being integrated into Western economies and military zones of influence. Now, the Philippines had been a Spanish colony, as was Guam. Hawaii, we mentioned, was independent, and Samoa was contested between different European powers. But by 1898, they all lose their independence, or lose their claims to independence. In the case of the Philippines, which had been a Spanish colony, claimed independence, and then the US fought a war to prevent the Philippines from becoming independent. And for about a half century, until the end of World War II, the Philippines was basically a colony of the US, and then briefly Japan during World War II. Guam and Samoa are still today US territorial possessions, right? They can have a non-voting delegate in Congress, but they don't get to have their congressional representatives actually, vote amongst the 435 representatives. And they don't have that direct role. They can vote in the primaries, but they don't have that direct role in, having electoral college votes, right? Same, of course, with Puerto Rico. Hawaii, of course, was turned into a US territory, and then later a state. But there were massive petitions from Native Hawaiians, massive numbers of petitions opposing the annexation of the US, which was really driven by US business interests in Hawaii. The companies that had come to take over the land and had set up sugar plantations, and thought that it would be advantageous for them for business and political reasons to annex to the United States. But this was not something that Native Hawaiians themselves wanted. Of course, they felt that their own indigenous government had been illegitimately overthrown. And the cartoon shows that as these peoples of the new colonies become part of the US, it's very much seen in this paternalistic, white supremacist way where they were children, and that's how the US justified blocking Filipinos, for instance, from becoming independent. The argument was, and this was made in very explicit terms, by senators, by leaders in the US, by academic leaders as well, that they were like children who needed to be taught how to become independent before they could exercise the right to self-government. So self-government was seen as something that white men possessed and as civilized members of the world, but these quote unquote savages were not fit for self-government at that time. And so what was the main reason for migration of Asians to the US? Well, from the American elite perspective, it was the need for labor, right? And there's a lot of ways we could talk about labor, but the most iconic example that people are aware of is the Transcontinental Railroad, right? Where the companies building from the West Coast wanted to finish as fast as possible so that they could, collect their payments from the government, but they also wanted to be done as cheaply and efficiently as possible so that they could keep as much of the profits for themselves. And so they turned to Chinese workers. Many Chinese immigrants had initially come to try to gain wealth through the gold rush. Very few got wealthy finding gold. There were a lot of discriminatory laws in mining. The ones that came ended up working in mines for low wages, very dangerous jobs. And then when that boom ends, many worked on the railroads. But when the railroads were complete, it was a big dramatic moment in US history, but one in which when they took the ceremonial picture, you basically don't see Chinese workers and their contributions represented, right? So that becomes symbolic of Asian immigrants being wanted and needed for their labor, but not being wanted as citizens or as members of society, right? And so in the aftermath of the railroads being completed, you had a push for Chinese exclusion. The phrase "the Chinese must go" was popularized. And then sometimes that was very specific and literal. Like there were Chinese workers who were driven out of towns. There were attempts to drive Japanese workers out of towns in the aftermath of Chinese exclusion. South Asian immigrants and Filipino immigrants were also literally driven out of towns where they were working. In some cases, particularly Chinese immigrants were lynched. There was episodes in Los Angeles, my hometown, in 1871, where roughly 20 Chinese immigrants, about 1 out of every 5 living in the entire city at the time, LA was a very small city in 1871, were lynched and killed in one day of violence, white supremacist mob violence. So this happened in a number of places, actual lynchings, but Chinese exclusion also refers to the formal legal declaration by Congress that Chinese immigrants were banned from migrating to the US with some tiny exceptions, right? So that was really a dramatic change in immigration policy to single out a specific group of people in a country to be completely, almost totally banned from coming to this country. Now, there are other anti-immigration measures passed, and to move quickly to 1924, this is also a broadening of restrictions against even Southern and European immigrants in the idea of preserving the native stock or the Anglo-Saxon origins of America. There were new national origins quotas placed, so Southern and Eastern Europe were restricted severely, but Asia was basically completely banned under this category of aliens ineligible to citizenship. And at this time, as we'll talk about, if you were an immigrant from Asia, you could not become a naturalized citizen the way whites and Europeans could. It creates this new idea of the illegal alien. the idea of deportation, mobilization of the Border Patrol, all of this, in many ways, was originally developed in response to Asian exclusion. And of course, today, a lot of it applies to migrants coming from Latin America. It leads to a deterioration of US-Japan relations, leading to World War II. But interesting, while people in Japan were very, it stirred up anti-American sentiment in Japan, it actually, this 1924 Immigration Act created a source of like influence and was admired by Hitler and the Nazis. This is, for instance, an article you can look at. Just Google 1924 Immigration Act, Nazis, Hitler. And here's an example of a book on this topic. Hitler basically wrote very approvingly of the US 1924 Immigration Act because it excluded strangers of the blood, quote unquote. He wrote in Mein Kampf about this, and later in a future writing, subsequent writing, that the idea of the US as a melting pot had been replaced by a scientific race selection process, so a racist idea of science that said that Europeans, and even specific Europeans, were superior to the non-white races and the other Europeans even. Hitler wrote, quote, "The capacity of assimilation for the American Union has given up with regard to the Chinese. People feel this clearly and know it, and for that reason they would most prefer to exclude these foreign bodies from immigration. The American Union feels itself to be a Nordic German, is also revealed by the apportionment of immigration quotas among the European peoples." So again, the idea was the US should have an immigration policy that favors people from Britain and France, and Scandinavia, and those who were considered to be the dominant, superior racial and ethnic groups in the world. And that was very explicit. There was no hiding it. There was a Ku Klux Klan revival. They were very active in politics in the 20s, but you didn't have to be a Klan member. They were very mainstream politicians that were very explicit in simply saying, the dominant groups that should make up the US are the Anglo-Saxons. Now, in this same era, Bhagat Singh Thind, a Sikh American, and Sikh Americans have been in the news tragically again. You may have seen that there was the mass shooting. 8 people died in Indianapolis at a FedEx facility. There's a high concentration of Sikh Americans, more recent immigrants mostly, who work at that FedEx, and 4 of the 8 who died are Sikh Americans. Sikhs are a minority group in India, but one of the largest religious groups in the world, because obviously India is a large country. The earlier wave of Sikh immigration to the US occurred in the early 20th century, and they were coming primarily, again, as workers, particularly in agriculture. And they were coming at a time when India was still a colony of Britain, right? And they were seeking more freedom for themselves, but also to advance the cause of Indian independence. Bhagat Singh Thind was born in 1892 and migrated from Punjab region in 1912, where there is a high concentration of Sikhs in India. He, as an immigrant, joined the US Army during World War I, and through this kind of exemption at the time that some observed in the immigration courts, was granted citizenship in 1920. But there was, as part of the exclusion movements, a drive to rule Asians ineligible for citizenship, while of course a lot of Asian immigrants themselves were pushing for the right to become citizens. In 1922, the US Supreme Court ruled that Japanese were ineligible to become naturalized citizens. In 1923, they came back with a similar ruling saying that immigrants from India, and effectively saying all Asians, could not become naturalized citizens, right? So this is a big blow. So there already are laws preventing Asians from migrating to the US, and then 1924 basically seals the deal for everyone except Filipinos, and that comes in the 1930s. But those that were here already were petitioning to become naturalized citizens, and the Supreme Court strikes that down in the 1920s definitively. And this had a very negative effect on the people, the communities that were here. One immigrant from India, Vaishno Das Bagai, you can see on the screen, said he had tried as hard as possible to be American, but he was told, I'm no longer US citizen. We're taking away your citizenship that you were granted improperly, the Supreme Court ruled, right? What if I made it myself, my children? We cannot exercise our rights. We cannot leave because our homelands are colonized. Humility and insults, who are responsible for all this? I do not choose to live a life of an interned person. And even some Indian immigrants who were deported to India were jailed or even murdered in some cases because of the role they played in pushing for independence from Britain. They were seen as basically seditionists. Is it worth living in a gilded cage? Obstacles this way, blockades that way, and the bridges burnt behind. Now, this was actually Vaishno Das Bagai's, sorry, I messed up my own slideshow. The kicker to this is it was actually his suicide note in 1928. So it had such a devastating effect, these exclusion laws. And again, the exclusion laws were designed to keep people in low-wage labor positions, to keep them from voting, obviously, from having any political representation. Schools were significantly segregated at that time. There were quote-unquote Oriental schools in places that ruled that Asians could not go to the white schools. But because of this significant role of Asians in farm labor, Asians were actually at the forefront of promoting agricultural organizing, unions, fights for fair labor treatment. And Filipino Americans, because they had been in farm labor since the early 20th century, were really at the forefront of creating the United Farm Workers with Mexican Americans. When the union was created in 1965, it actually started with a strike by Filipino immigrant workers who had a lot of labor organizing experience in Delano, California. But more broadly within farming, there were attempts and laws passed to basically block Asians from owning land. They were called alien land laws. And then eventually there were even laws passed to prevent them from leasing land. California had one of the biggest laws, but Texas had an alien land law as well. And these were basically not deemed unconstitutional until after World War II. There was also a segregation within housing as well. And sometimes there were these violent campaigns to intimidate homeowners from buying or leasing houses in predominantly white neighborhoods. There were contracts passed that said this house cannot be sold to or occupied by African Americans or Asian Americans. These were very prominent all over the country, but in the West Coast areas where Asian Americans lived, the contracts sometimes specifically said no Orientals or quote unquote Mongoloids can live in these houses. Now, Dr. Seuss was in the news because the Dr. Seuss Family Foundation itself said that there were some stereotypes in his books that needed to be really recognized. And this is actually not from a book. He was a cartoonist, political cartoonist for newspapers during World War II. And you can see in this cartoon, very much looks like Dr. Seuss characters, but these are actually meant to be Japanese Americans who are waiting for Japan to give them the signal to commit sabotage on the West Coast of the US. So what Dr. Seuss is saying is that Japanese Americans, even if they're citizens, are like sleeper cells just waiting to sabotage the US in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Basically, there were warnings that there would be a second Pearl Harbor, that Japanese Americans would play a role. So in this case, Japanese Americans are basically portrayed as dangerous and disloyal, and Dr. Seuss was actually campaigning for Japanese Americans to be put in concentration camps at this time. Okay, we're going to move quickly and more closely to the present because I don't want to run out of time. You can see since the 20th century, the country is changing very quickly. By 2050, quote unquote, non-white groups are projected to be a minority, and the Asian population will be 9–10% or so, much, much bigger than it was when it was far less than 1%. Now, there are racial stereotypes that go back to this earlier era of war and the portraying of Asian immigration as invasion or a yellow peril, the gendered stereotype of Asian women as dangerous dragon ladies, and then of all groups basically as perpetual foreigners, no matter how long they've lived here. And of course, that relates to the fact that, again, the earlier generations couldn't even become citizens. But after World War II, there's this new image of the model minority. And we're going to talk more about that. It sounds kind of positive. Hey, you're high achieving, you work very hard, but it has a very pernicious side to it. And this is an example of an article in the 1960s when this model minority image of Asians become more popular. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can see this article was particularly about Chinese Americans. And it's basically saying Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans work hard. They don't go on welfare. And it's basically saying that in the 1960s, when there are calls for civil rights laws, affirmative action policies, anti-discrimination measures, minority set-asides to remedy racial inequity, particularly as African Americans, right, had been ghettoized, segregated, locked in structural poverty. This article is basically saying, well, if you view Chinese Americans as a model minority, then nobody should need civil rights laws or anti-discrimination laws or government programs. That the government should just simply let the business sector take care of everything, and the people that work hardest will get ahead, and those who are in poverty have no one to blame but themselves, right? This is an old argument that denies the history of racism, structural discrimination, white supremacy. Obviously, there's still structural discrimination today. There's gender discrimination, which is why women don't make as much as men on average. But Asians were sort of used as a stereotype to say that African Americans should not have civil rights laws. This stereotype of the model minority becomes more prominent as there's younger generations of Asian Americans going to college. Many of them do succeed in becoming doctors, scientists, engineers, but it also creates this stereotype that everyone is naturally good at math. I mean, the reality is that the people succeeding are more likely to have parents who were able to immigrate to this country because there were preferences for doctors or scientists or engineers, particularly during the Cold War era. And a lot of those preferences still exist. It also creates a negative stereotype for Asian Americans. People that want to become doctors should have every right to become doctors or scientists. But some people want to be creative writers. Some people want to be theater majors. Some people want to be, sociology majors, right? So this stereotype of Asian Americans sometimes themselves feeling like they have to fulfill these STEM expectations, right, in science, engineering, medicine, math, are things that Asian American students themselves have begun to reconsider and challenge. Now, the model minority, again, doesn't protect Asian Americans from anti-Asian violence. And obviously, we've seen a lot more anti-Asian violence, just in the past year. But one of the most iconic cases comes from 1982 when a man named Vincent Chin in Detroit was beaten to death by two white men, one who was a laid-off auto worker, one who was a foreman in the auto industry. And one of them was heard saying, "It's because of you MFs that we're all out of work." So at a time when Japan was seen as threatening to the US economy, similar to how China is viewed today, there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. And this was basically projected onto all Asians as a foreign group who posed a threat. Vincent Chin's killers pled guilty to manslaughter that was reduced from second-degree murder, and the judge gave them probation and a fine. So they beat him to death in the middle of the busiest street in Detroit in view of two police officers, right? And the judge said, but these men aren't a threat to society. They just had basically that one press conference about the Atlanta guy. They had a really bad day. Things got out of hand. And so all they need is probation and a fine. So that story of Vincent Chin is oftentimes repeated as an example of the need for more vigilance against anti-Asian violence and the need for the justice system and society in general to really respect Asian American history and culture and life itself to a far greater degree. Now, I mentioned a lot of Asians came as immigrants, oftentimes as laborers, and more recently as professionals since 1965. There's really an exception to that. The majority of Vietnamese and Southeast Asians in the US came, or their parents or grandparents came as refugees after effectively, the US withdrew from Vietnam, having lost the war. And particularly those who had been allied with the US faced persecution in the aftermath of the war. And so there was initially laws to allow some refugees in, and increasingly, they needed to bring in family members. There was still unrest that spread to Cambodia, where a genocidal regime, the Khmer Rouge, took power. In Laos, for instance, there are still bombs that were dropped during the Vietnam War era that didn't explode. And so there are places in Laos that became basically almost impossible to farm or for people to live in. So there are refugees that have been coming from Southeast Asia since 1975, and then those populations have scattered across parts of the US. Many are concentrated in Texas, and their children obviously are now part of the population, and there's a growing number of US-born Southeast Asian Americans. If you want to read a very accessible book about Vietnamese refugees, this is a graphic novel called The Best We Could Do by T. Bui. And the story of Vietnamese refugees in Texas is really important. In fact, you're much closer to Seadrift than I am. I think you're only about a little over an hour away since you're on the coast. Seadrift is closer to Galveston. And there's a documentary you can watch. It just came out last year. It aired on PBS called Seadrift, about refugees, racism, and reconciliation. And when refugees came from Vietnam, there was a lot of anti-immigrant and refugee sentiment at that time. And a lot of people were saying, oh, if they come here, they're going to take our jobs, or they don't speak English, or, whatever other stereotypes. They're going to eat our dogs, so on. Or they're the enemy. Again, a lot of times when there's a war in Asia, there's a generalized stereotype of Asians as gooks or enemies, and they all look alike. Right. And so when Vietnamese refugees are coming, even if they had been allied with the US against the communists, they were viewed as the Viet Cong, or, the dangerous enemy. And so in Seadrift, Texas, in the late 70s and early 80s, there was actually a drive by the Ku Klux Klan to chase all Vietnamese refugees out of Seadrift, Texas, after this racist conflict had, in one case, led to Vietnamese refugee basically defending himself and killing a white man who he said was attacking him. He was acquitted in a court of law. Bruce Springsteen actually wrote a song about this called Galveston Bay. And there's this documentary and articles you can read about, again, this history much closer to where you live geographically. That was very prominent in Texas 4 decades ago, and probably isn't taught in textbooks or talked about much. But now that, again, we know there's been a resurgence in white supremacist violence, in anti-Asian violence and racism, these histories are really important for us to read and learn about. And there's a lot of reconciliation that actually happens in Seadrift, Texas, that is important to learn about. So I'm going to start wrapping up, and I'm going to go through the rest really quickly. But just to show the demographic projections show that not only has the Asian population of Texas grown very rapidly, it's projected to continue growing to 2.4 million by the end of this decade, right? So it's almost tripling in 2 decades. So we're in the midst of this dramatic growth in the Asian population. And if you go to the suburbs of the Dallas-Fort Worth region where I am, you can really see where there's a lot more Asian restaurants, businesses, boba tea shops. You can see in numeric terms, Asians, even while being one of the smallest groups, are in absolute terms growing at a faster rate in population than the white population is in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. Irving, Texas is an example of where the Asian population in 1990 was only 6,000. Now there's 47,000. The Hispanic and Black populations have grown too. And so now this city, which, you know, after World War II would have been almost entirely white as a restricted, segregated suburb, is now, you know, overwhelmingly a non-white city. But with that has come new frictions, and tensions. So for instance, there are some parts of Irving, Texas, like this school, that are over 90% Asian students. But there have also been in these neighborhoods where there's a high percentage now of Chinese and Indian Americans, hate crime acts like this, where people had in their mailbox these death threat letters saying, leave the country or you'll be shot, right? So this is, again, just outside of Dallas. And if you look at who participated in the insurrection of January 6th, a lot of the people actually came from these suburbs of Dallas that are becoming increasingly racially diverse. This article in the Washington Post is about Frisco, Texas, where there's a lot of Asians now, but historically it was an all-white area. In Carrollton, which is also a northern suburb of Dallas, a Korean American who's now the city council, when he ran, there was an anonymous letter saying, you know, he's not American. He's gonna try to defeat, you know, a white American. These foreigners are trying to take over. So that happened in Carrollton. Carrollton was also in the news because just last month, 3 teachers in middle school gave a test that basically said which stereotype about Chinese people is correct. And that was a multiple choice. You had a choice of 3 stereotypes. They were put on leave. I'm not sure what's going to happen to them. Obviously, across the country, there have been a surge in violent attacks, as well as microaggressions, you know, ethnic slurs, racial slurs. These are documented. It's easy to find, you know, in the newspapers now. But they really go back, as I was talking about, to this history of Asians being seen as the enemy of the US, right? In wars, but even when the war's over, right? These stereotypes and these racist slurs continue. You know, I was called a number of these names growing up, and, you know, I'm 4th generation Japanese American, and I was born, you know, 25 years after the end of World War II. But the Vietnam War was going on at that time. In Midland, Odessa, Asian American family was stabbed by a man who said he was afraid of Chinese infecting people with coronavirus in Midland, Texas, right? And they weren't even Chinese, but again, that doesn't matter, right? Anti-Asian violence is rooted in stereotyping and racism. It's not rooted in specifically getting the ethnic culture correct. And then in San Antonio just last month, after a Vietnamese American restaurant owner was on CNN saying he's immunocompromised, he has cancer, and so he opposed the governor's new order, you know, saying that you don't have to wear a mask anymore, right? He, in the aftermath of opposing that Governor Abbott's order, was almost immediately attacked with racist graffiti, things like Kung Flu, anti-Asian sentiments on his ramen noodle shop in San Antonio, Texas. So these things are happening all over the country. They're happening in Texas. Texas is the 3rd largest in population of Asians, and also the 3rd for the number of anti-Asian bias incidents reported in the last year. But Asian Americans in Texas, particularly in Georgia, right, are voting in much larger numbers, right? And so this notion that we are a silent model minority really is being refuted in practice by people having rallies, voter registration, and of course, you know, Georgia was so close that the number of Asians who voted actually, you know, was basically, you know, enough to change the outcome of the race. If Asian Americans had not voted, Donald Trump probably would have won Georgia, and Republicans could have potentially held on to 2 Senate seats as well. And so just want to close as we think about, you know, anti-Asian violence and discrimination. Oftentimes you'll hear, and President Biden said this, you know, this is not America. And, usually we understand what he's aspiring to say is this is not what we want America to be, that we want America to be understood differently. But I'm saying we should also take a step back and not just say, this is how things are, how do we make them a little bit better? Or how do we even fix what's broken? What if we were to instead say, what would America be like today if racial equity had always been practiced throughout history? If you had never had a Chinese exclusion law, if you had never had a ban on Asians becoming citizens or voting, right? In conjunction with, racial justice for African Americans, in conjunction with Native American sovereignty being respected. If we start from the ideal of what we think this country and this land and people coming together should have meant from the beginning, that opens up our minds to really thinking about equity and social justice in much more profound and expansive ways. So I know I went over a little bit in time. I'm just going to stop here. And if you have questions or comments, feel free to pass those along.
Well, thank you so much. You'll just have to take your applause from me and Giotaro because nobody else can get on right now. We appreciate you so much. And I think, did you pass the presenter rights back to Julie? Because I think she
okay. Here you go.
Oh, Susan got on to show her appreciation too. So there you go. I was looking through the participant list, Scott, and I think you'll be happy to know that we have people from around the country on with us today, people at other universities, as well as a lot of our students, faculty, and staff. And so I think you've done a good work today. I think of you as an activist educator, and you definitely did that work today. So thank you so much. We do have a few questions, and actually we're getting a lot of requests for the recording. I do want everyone to know that it will be available on our AAPI website after we make sure it has all the accessibility requirements met, and it will also be on our Student Engagement and Success YouTube site as well. So I do want to ask a question because I think naming is really important. And you said early on that we shouldn't just automatically link Asian American and Pacific Islander. And I just wondered if you would talk about that a little bit more. Why don't we leave them, why don't more people leave them separated? I mean, why do they get linked so much? And when should we do that? When should we not do that?
Yeah, I think there's really two issues there. I think for Pacific Islanders, it's because, again, there's a history of Pacific Islanders being indigenous peoples, right? And still today identifying as indigenous peoples in the Pacific. So when you talk about Pacific Islanders, there are immigrants from the Pacific who now live in Texas or California, right? But there are also Chamorros in Guam who are the native indigenous peoples. And so the idea of being connected to an immigrant group that has a very different experience, it's just a different experience. I mean, we don't call, Asian Americans and Mexican Americans one group, right? I mean, because they come from different backgrounds and have different experience. Well, whereas there was this self-identification of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, eventually Southeast Asians coming together to form Asian American Studies, Asian American community organizations. And so there's a much more self-identification of Asians coming together than Pacific Islanders and Asians being historically part of one group. So again, it's not that that never happens, but it should be a voluntary thing rather than us just saying, hey, everybody belongs to the same category. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes me think if maybe we shouldn't think about Pacific Islanders as being more indigenous and talk about them when we talk about indigenous peoples.
Certainly within Pacific Islander studies, there's obviously, again, there's a migration all over the world, but there is that core focus on indigeneity in Native Pacific Islander history, particularly, in parts Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, which being the three main components of Pacific Islander formation.
It's such a large geography, when we think about AAPI just on its own, right? And we're going to have a panel tomorrow and in the next few weeks in which I think some of that's going to be discussed a little, more in depth. We have one session called Are Indians Asians? right? So that we'll certainly be hashing some of this out.
Yeah, and so that's the second part of your question is there's been a push to have data disaggregation, right? So that when we talk about Asians as a group, we also recognize that there is vast disparities in education, income, and representation. So as I said, there are some groups that have poverty rates below the national average, but some that have poverty rates far above the national average. Same thing with education attainment. And so to put everyone in one group could lead us to have policies that don't actually reflect the most marginalized members or the smallest groups as well.
I love that you included the information about the Filipino farm workers, because we in South Texas do have a pretty good understanding of Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, but they were in partnership with the Filipino farm workers. So I was really glad that you shared that. We did have a question about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the slide that you showed there. There were a lot of images on that slide. Where did those images show up? I mean, it looked like propaganda.
Yeah, so these would have been like the equivalent of today editorial cartoons. So there could have been in newspapers. Sometimes these organizations had their own publications, or unions could have publications. I mean, the union movement obviously plays an important role in equal rights, and dignity for workers in this country. But for a long period of time, it was labor rights for white workers and white men, and non-white workers and immigrants were viewed as a threat to, right? And so the idea of solidarity and, equal rights for all was not always a practice, or wasn't even the main response of a number of labor unions who saw themselves as dignity for white workers, by excluding the non-white workers.
So final question for
Sure,
you,
sure.
and the one I imagine you'll be comfortable with is thinking about higher education, and the responsibilities of those of us at institutions of higher education. What can we do? I mean, what can we do? I know we're educating. Do we continue to do this right now? Is there something we should be doing beyond that? Is there actions we should be taking?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this is also Earth Week, right? So as we say, every day should be Earth Day, because we only have one planet, right? And we're really in peril in a lot of ways right now if we don't change what we're doing. I think similarly, every month should be Black History Month. Every month should be, Native American History Month. I think we need to make these things, they should be special events at certain times of the year to draw people, who've never had a chance. But these opportunities to learn, right, and grow should occur on a regular basis. So you referred to me as an activist educator, and I definitely accept that term. But it's not something that's really a choice if you're working in Asian American studies or more broadly in ethnic studies. So for instance, when I was an undergraduate, a long time ago, but not that long ago, there was not a single class in Asian American studies in this very large, world-class university I was in. And so when I asked the dean of my college, could we just have, we're talking about bringing a visiting adjunct professor in for one class, it would have cost them nothing, right, for their total budget. The dean said to my face, and I'll never forget this, he said, it's too much to ask for one entire class on Asian Americans. Maybe you could go to the sociology department and see if their class on immigration could have a week or two on Asian American. So that was literally the dean's view, that this topic was not significant enough to even have one class. And so, I couldn't even study Asian American studies if I hadn't been a student activist and really basically directed some self-studies with myself and other students. And then there is now a program, a small program on that where I went to college, University of Pennsylvania, but it's because of persistent activism, right? And so there's just not a choice, right? What ethnic studies points out is that education is inherently political. It's always about people making choices about what we value and what we disregard, right? And so I think you know, we need ethnic studies classes, Asian American Pacific Islander studies classes to be regular features where people are already teaching about US history, global history, politics, culture, arts, even science. Those ethnic studies perspectives need to be incorporated, right, into what we're already teaching. And then I think, right, for those of you in student affairs or academic affairs, we need to hire the experts in administration who have that background in Asian American studies, ethnic studies. And, you know, if you go to NCORE, for instance, there are all kinds of experts there that you can go to workshops with and that you can potentially recruit and hire that have this special training and background, right, in multiculturalism and specifically, in some cases, Asian American and Pacific Islander studies.
Thank you very much. And we really appreciate you today. And, you know, I originally heard you on, I believe, Code Switch. It was some NPR podcast, and I thought, this guy's in Texas. We've got to hear from him down here in Corpus Christi. So thank you so much for joining us. We do want to promote tomorrow's panel event. Julie, can you show that slide? Do we have that? Tomorrow's panel event is, you can see it live in person if you'd like. We are, you know, following all of our COVID protocols, but we will be in the UC Anchor Ballroom tomorrow at 3 o'clock. You do need to RSVP for this through iEngage. We have a count of how many people are coming because of COVID protocols, but there are seats available. So if you would like to attend, please do. This panel will include the wonderful Gyataro Young talking about some of his experiences as a young man coming to Texas as a senior in high school. So Gyataro, you want to give a wave there? We're promoting you for tomorrow. So you'll see him as well as some other people from our campus community. And then we're going to have events all month. You can find those on the website at aapi.tamucc.edu. We hope that everyone will join us for these events, and we'll think about the questions that Scott posed to us today as we move through the month and think about some systemic change and some interpersonal change that can happen for each of us. All right. Thank you all so much for your time today, and I hope to see some of you tomorrow and throughout the month.